There was a time when cartoons were more than just entertainment, they were a part of our childhood, our everyday lives, our friends, our heroes, and worlds we wished we could live in. But as time moved on, new shows and characters arrived, and many of the cartoons we once loved slowly disappeared from the spotlight. So today, we're going back in time to revisit 10 cartoons that once ruled the screen. First up, Heathcliff. Before Garfield became the famous cartoon cat that everyone knew, there was another feline troublemaker making his mark on television: Heathcliff. Heathcliff was a mischievous orange cat who was always looking for his next adventure. He wasn't the kind of character who simply sat around waiting for something to happen. Whether he was chasing food, causing trouble in the neighborhood, getting into fights with other animals, or finding some clever way to outsmart the people around him, Heathcliff always seemed to turn an ordinary day into chaos. And that was the charm of the character. Heathcliff wasn't a perfect hero. He was selfish, clever, stubborn, and sometimes downright troublesome, but he was also funny and strangely lovable. His stories were built around simple, everyday situations that could quickly become ridiculous. A little hunger could turn into a full-blown mission for food. A small argument could become a hilarious neighborhood adventure. The animated series brought that personality to life with fast-paced comedy, exaggerated reactions, physical humor, and short stories that were easy for younger viewers to follow. You didn't need a complicated plot to enjoy Heathcliff. You simply watched him get into trouble and waited to see how he would get himself out of it. That simplicity was a big part of the appeal. For many kids, Heathcliff felt less like a traditional superhero and more like that mischievous character you could always count on to make something happen. He was unpredictable, funny, and just troublesome enough to keep you watching. The character had already existed in comic strips before making his way into animation, and the television versions helped introduce Heathcliff to an even wider audience. Over time, he became one of those recognizable cartoon characters from the era when animated shows filled afternoon and weekend television schedules. But television was changing. New animated series, new characters, and new programming trends gradually pushed many older cartoons away from the spotlight. Heathcliff didn't simply vanish from existence. The character continued through comics, reruns, merchandise, and later adaptations, but the same place he once held in everyday television was slowly taken by newer generations of cartoons. And perhaps that's why Heathcliff is still remembered today. Not because he was the most powerful character or the most complicated one, but because he was simply fun. He was the mischievous cat who could turn an ordinary day into an adventure, and for a generation of viewers, that was more than enough. But if Heathcliff's world was filled with mischief and comedy, our next cartoon takes us somewhere completely different: a strange and dangerous future where civilization has been transformed. Second, Thundarr the Barbarian.
Thundarr the Barbarian!
Imagine a future where the world we know no longer exists. New York City has become a wasteland. Familiar landmarks stand in ruins, and powerful wizards rule over scattered kingdoms. That was the strange and fascinating world of Thundarr the Barbarian. The series premiered on ABC in 1980, but its story was set centuries into the future, around the year 3994. According to the show's story, a catastrophic event in 1994 changed Earth forever after a comet passed between the Earth and the Moon, leaving the Moon shattered and the planet transformed. What remained was a world where the ruins of our civilization stood alongside magic, monsters, mutants, and advanced technology. And in the middle of this bizarre new world was Thundarr, a powerful warrior carrying the legendary Sunsword. He wasn't a king or a wizard. He was a fighter traveling across this dangerous world, standing against those who used power to control ordinary people. But Thundarr didn't travel alone. Beside him was Princess Ariel, a powerful sorceress who brought intelligence and magic to the team. And then there was Ookla the Mock, a huge, powerful creature whose strength made him the perfect companion for Thundarr. Together, the three formed one of the most unusual hero teams of Saturday morning animation. Their adventures took them through the ruins of places that audiences could actually recognize. One week they could be exploring the remains of Manhattan, The next they could be fighting enemies near the Alamo, Mount Rushmore, Las Vegas, or other familiar locations. And that's what made the show so interesting. It wasn't simply a fantasy world. It was our world, transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Ancient ruins represented the civilization that had been lost, while wizards and strange creatures controlled what came after it. The series mixed sword and sorcery with science fiction and post-apocalyptic adventure at a time when that combination was still unusual on Saturday morning television. The villains were just as strange as the world itself. Evil wizards, strange creatures, mutated races, and people searching for the technology of the ancient world constantly stood in the hero's way. Some episodes even turned famous locations into completely different versions of themselves. For example, the very first episode sends Thundarr, Ariel, and Ookla toward Manhattan, the ruins of Manhattan, while they faced the two-faced wizard Gemini and his groundlings. Other stories took them across a world filled with dangerous magic, mysterious technology, and remnants of the civilization that had disappeared centuries earlier. And perhaps that was the biggest reason Thundarr the Barbarian felt different. Most cartoons gave children a completely imaginary world. Thundarr did something else. It took places they could recognize and asked a fascinating question. What if our world survived, but everything we knew about it was gone? The series produced 21 episodes across 2 seasons and became one of those shows remembered for its unusual combination of fantasy, science fiction, and post-apocalyptic storytelling. But like many cartoons from that era, its time on television was relatively short. The original series ended after its 2nd season, and although reruns kept it alive for later audiences, Thundarr eventually became more of a cult memory than a regular part of children's television. Today, what makes Thundarr memorable isn't just the sword, the monsters, or the magic. It's the idea behind the world itself, a ruined future built from the remains of our own civilization. But television had another kind of adventure waiting for its viewers. Because next, we were going to meet a team whose job was to face something far more terrifying: ghosts. Third, the real Ghostbusters. What if the ghosts you thought only existed in scary stories were actually walking through the streets of New York? That was the basic idea behind the real Ghostbusters, the animated series that brought the Ghostbusters back to television in 1986, following the success of the 1984 movie. But this wasn't just a simple cartoon about people chasing ghosts. At the center of the series were 4 paranormal investigators: Peter Venkman, Egon Spengler, Ray Stantz, and Winston Zeddemore. Alongside them were their secretary Janine Melnitz and one character who would become impossible to forget: Slimer. Their job was simple. When something supernatural appeared, the Ghostbusters were the people you called. And the ghosts they faced were anything but ordinary. One episode could bring a terrifying creature out of the shadows. Another could turn an ordinary New York location into a supernatural nightmare. Curses, spirits, strange creatures, haunted places, and bizarre paranormal problems became part of the team's everyday work. But the show had a secret weapon. It didn't take itself too seriously. The supernatural elements created the mystery and excitement, while the personalities of the Ghostbusters brought comedy into almost every adventure. Peter's attitude, Egon's scientific curiosity, Ray's enthusiasm, Winston's grounded personality, and Slimer's chaotic behavior created a team that felt completely different from one another. And then there was Slimer. Originally introduced as a ghostly creature from the movie, Slimer became one of the most recognizable parts of the animated series. His funny behavior and constant troublemaking made the supernatural world feel less frightening and much more entertaining for younger viewers. As the series continued, Slimer became increasingly important to the show's identity. That combination was what made the real Ghostbusters so memorable. It could give you the feeling of watching a horror story, and then suddenly make you laugh. It could introduce a creepy ghost, and then turn the entire situation into a ridiculous adventure. For kids, that balance was perfect. The ghosts created curiosity and a little bit of fear, but the comedy and familiar characters made the show feel safe and fun. The series premiered on September 13, 1986, and continued for several years, eventually running until 1991. It also changed its format along the way. In 1988, it became Slimer and the Real Ghostbusters, adding a separate Slimer-focused segment and giving the character an even bigger role. And there was another interesting story happening behind the scenes. Because Filmation already owned the rights to the name Ghostbusters from its earlier 1975 television series, two different animated Ghostbusters shows appeared around the same time in 1986. Filmation's version premiered first, while Columbia and DIC called their movie-based series The Real Ghostbusters. Even newspapers at the time pointed out how confusing the situation was for viewers. But eventually, when people remember the Ghostbusters cartoon of that era, it is often the Real Ghostbusters that comes to mind: the four investigators, the proton packs, the ghost traps, the Ecto-1, and of course Slimer. It wasn't simply another superhero cartoon. It created a world where the supernatural could be terrifying, hilarious, and exciting all at once. And that's exactly why, decades later, the sound of that Ghostbusters theme or the sight of those familiar proton packs can instantly take many viewers back to Saturday morning television. And then came a cartoon where the heroes weren't just ordinary people fighting monsters. They were lions, warriors, and guardians of an entire kingdom. Fourth, ThundarCats. Imagine a world where the survivors of a destroyed home planet arrive on a strange new world and have to build a new home while defending themselves from an ancient evil. That was the world of ThundarCats. The series premiered in 1985 and followed a group of cat-like humanoids who escaped the destruction of their home planet, Thundarr, and eventually settled on a distant world known as Third Earth. But finding a new home was only the beginning of their story. At the center of this world was Lion-O. Young, powerful, and still learning what it truly meant to lead, Lion-O became the Lord of the ThundarCats. And in his hand was one of the show's most iconic weapons, the Sword of Omens. But Lion-O was never alone. The ThundarCats were a team, and each member brought something different. Tigra was intelligent and thoughtful. Panthro was the team's engineer and powerhouse. Chitara was incredibly fast. Wily Kit and Wily Cat brought youth and mischief, while Snarf became one of the group's most recognizable companions. Together, they defended their home and helped people across Third Earth, facing strange creatures, powerful enemies, ancient forces, and mysterious technology. But every great hero needs a great villain, and ThundarCats had one of the most memorable villains of its era, Mumra. Mumra was an ancient evil who lived in the Black Pyramid and repeatedly plotted against the ThundarCats. He could use magic, deception, and disguises to manipulate situations and attack the heroes when they least expected it. His presence gave the series a darker edge that separated it from many ordinary Saturday morning adventures. The central conflict was simple, but powerful. The ThundarCats represented courage, loyalty, and protection, while Mumra represented power, fear, and evil. And that battle could take the characters almost anywhere. One episode might involve a mysterious creature or an ancient secret. Another could send the ThundarCats into a dangerous location or force Lion-O to prove himself. The series even gave Lion-O a series of trials designed to test his strength, speed, cunning, and ability to become a true leader. But what made ThundarCats truly special was its world. It wasn't simply a show about heroes fighting villains. It created an entire mythology: Thundarr, Third Earth, the ThundarCats, the Sword of Omens, Mumra, the ancient spirits of evil, and dozens of memorable characters and creatures. The animation, dramatic music, powerful character designs, and larger-than-life storytelling gave the series an identity that was easy to recognize within seconds. And it wasn't a short-lived experiment. The original series ran from 1985 to 1989, with 130 episodes, giving ThundarCats plenty of time to build its world and its fanbase. Even decades later, the image of Lion-O raising the Sword of Omens, the ThundarCats gathering together, and Mumra transforming into his terrifying form remains deeply connected to the golden age of animated television. Because ThunderCats wasn't just about cats fighting monsters. It was about finding a new home, protecting your people, learning to become a leader, and standing together when darkness arrived. And that combination of action, fantasy, mythology, memorable characters, and a clear battle between good and evil helped give ThunderCats a lasting place in cartoon history. But every hero doesn't need a magical sword or superpowers. Sometimes, all you need is a man with so many gadgets that even an ordinary day can turn into complete chaos. Fifth, Inspector Gadget. Inspector Gadget. Imagine a police inspector who has a helicopter hidden in his hat, springs in his legs, extendable arms, roller skates, and seemingly a gadget for almost every situation. That was Inspector Gadget. The animated series first arrived in the early 1980s and introduced audiences to one of the strangest crime fighters on television, a police inspector whose body was packed with futuristic gadgets. Whenever trouble appeared, Gadget's famous Go-Go Gadget call could activate another ridiculous piece of technology. But there was one small problem. Inspector Gadget wasn't exactly the smartest detective. He was brave, well-meaning, and determined to stop criminals. But he was also incredibly clumsy and often completely unaware of what was actually happening around him. His gadgets were impressive, but Gadget himself frequently made situations even more chaotic. And that's where the comedy came from. A simple mission could turn into complete madness as Gadget accidentally activated the wrong gadget, misunderstood what was happening, or somehow escaped danger without even realizing how close he had come to disaster. But behind the scenes, two characters were doing the real detective work. The first was Penny, Gadget's brilliant young niece. While her uncle was busy chasing criminals, Penny secretly investigated the cases using her high-tech computer book and special communication technology. She was often the one who discovered what the villains were planning and figured out how to stop them. And then there was Brain. Brain was Penny's incredibly intelligent dog, and his job was basically to keep Inspector Gadget alive. He would secretly follow Gadget, disguise himself to investigate the villains, and repeatedly save Gadget from traps and dangerous situations. But there was a hilarious twist. Gadget almost always misunderstood Brain's attempts to help him. To Gadget, Brain often looked like the suspicious one. So while Brain was trying to save his life, Gadget was usually trying to arrest him. That running joke became one of the show's most memorable comedy formulas. And standing behind all of this was Dr. Claw, the mysterious leader of the criminal organization MAD. Dr. Claw would create elaborate schemes designed to defeat Gadget, usually from the safety of his secret headquarters. Yet despite all his planning, Penny and Brain would secretly interfere, Gadget would somehow stumble through the mission, and Dr. Claw's plan would fall apart. And there was another mystery that made Dr. Claw even more memorable. For much of the original series, audiences never actually saw his face, only his arms and hands. That simple visual choice gave the villain an almost mysterious, larger-than-life presence. The formula was simple. Dr. Claw creates the plan. Penny discovers the plan. Brain tries to stop it. Gadget accidentally gets involved. And somehow, Gadget gets the credit. That formula could be repeated again and again because every episode had the same basic ingredients: crime, gadgets, disguises, misunderstandings, comedy, and a last-second escape. The original series ran for 86 episodes across 2 seasons, beginning in 1983, and its reruns continued to reach audiences for years afterward. The character also became the foundation for a much larger franchise, including later animated productions and films. But what really made Inspector Gadget unforgettable wasn't just the technology. It was the contrast. He looked like a high-tech super agent, but behaved like a completely clueless detective. He had more gadgets than almost anyone could imagine. Yet he constantly needed Penny and Brain to save the day. And that combination of technology, mystery, physical comedy, and lovable characters gave Inspector Gadget an identity that was instantly recognizable. Even today, just hearing "Go-Go Gadget" is enough to take many viewers straight back to the cartoons of their childhood. And if Gadget's world was powered by technology, the next cartoon takes us into a world of adventure, treasure, and one extremely wealthy duck. 6. DuckTales.
Life is like a hurricane.
DuckTales. Imagine having so much money that you could literally swim through it, and then using that fortune to travel across the world searching for even more treasure. That was Scrooge McDuck. But when DuckTales arrived on television in 1987, it wasn't simply a cartoon about a rich old duck and his enormous fortune. It was an adventure series built around family, curiosity, treasure hunting, mystery, and the excitement of discovering what might be waiting around the next corner. At the center of the story was Scrooge McDuck, the wealthy Scottish duck who lived in the famous McDuck Manor and had spent his life building his fortune. But despite all his money, Scrooge's greatest adventures weren't sitting inside his vault. They were out in the world. And very often, he had his 3 grandnephews with him: Huey, Dewey, and Louie. The 3 boys brought a completely different energy to the story. They were curious, clever, mischievous, and always ready for an adventure. Instead of simply watching Scrooge's stories from the sidelines, they became an important part of the adventures themselves. Together, they could travel to ancient ruins, search for lost treasures, uncover mysterious secrets, and find themselves in situations that were much bigger than anything they had expected. And that's where DuckTales really stood out. The show treated adventure almost like a treasure map. You never quite knew where the next story would take you. One episode could involve an ancient legend or a lost treasure. Another could take the characters to a completely different part of the world. There were mysteries to solve, villains to escape, dangerous situations to survive, and sometimes a lesson hidden underneath all the excitement. But Scrooge wasn't simply chasing money. His personality was one of the most important parts of the show. He was extremely wealthy, but he was also adventurous, stubborn, competitive, proud, and deeply attached to the life he had built. For Scrooge, the thrill wasn't always about owning the treasure. It was about earning it, discovering it, and proving that he could overcome whatever stood in his way. And Disney knew exactly how to turn that idea into television. The stories were colorful and fast-moving, but they also gave the characters personality and emotional stakes. The comedy kept things light, while the mysteries and adventures gave the episodes momentum. That combination helped DuckTales become one of the defining animated shows of its era. The series premiered in 1987 and became a major part of Disney's television animation lineup. Its popularity eventually helped establish a wider generation of Disney animated television shows and contributed to what became known as the Disney Afternoon era. And then there was the opening theme. Even people who haven't watched the show in years can often recognize the famous DuckTales. Woohoo! That song, the money bin, Scrooge's adventures, and the 3 nephews became instantly recognizable pieces of television nostalgia. The original series ran for 100 episodes across 4 seasons, ending in 1990. But the story didn't disappear. DuckTales remained popular through reruns, home video, merchandise, and later a major revival series that premiered in 2017. That's the mark of a cartoon that became more than just a television show. It became a world people wanted to return to, a world where treasure could be hidden anywhere, where an ordinary trip could become a global adventure, and where the richest duck in the world still couldn't resist the excitement of discovering something new. And perhaps that's why DuckTales has lasted for so long. Because underneath all the money and treasure, the show was really selling something much more valuable. The feeling that adventure could be waiting just around the corner. But adventure wasn't only for ducks. Because next, a group of small detectives was getting ready to solve mysteries of their own. 7th, Chip and Dale, Rescue Rangers. Chip and Dale, Rescue Rangers. What if 2 mischievous chipmunks stopped causing trouble and decided to become detectives? That was the idea behind Chip and Dale, Rescue Rangers. When the series arrived in 1989, Disney took the familiar characters of Chip and Dale and gave them an entirely new world. Instead of simply being comic side characters, the 2 chipmunks became the leaders of a small detective team that took on mysteries that were often far too big for them. At the center were Chip and Dale, Chip was the more serious, organized, and determined leader. Dale was more relaxed, impulsive, and always ready for fun. Their personalities were completely different, and that difference became one of the show's biggest sources of comedy. They could argue, compete with each other, and still work together when it really mattered. But they weren't alone. The Rescue Rangers team included Gadget Hackwrench, an inventive mouse who could build almost anything, Monterey Jack, a strong and adventurous mouse with a love for cheese, and Zipper, the tiny fly who might have been the smallest member of the team but was still an important part of their adventures. Together, they operated like a miniature detective agency, and their cases could begin with something incredibly simple: a missing object, a strange disappearance, a mysterious crime. But what looked like a small problem could quickly turn into a much bigger adventure. The team would investigate clues, follow suspects, build gadgets, travel through places designed around their tiny size, and eventually uncover whatever mystery was hiding underneath the surface. That tiny perspective was one of the show's most creative ideas. A normal city became an enormous world when you were only a few inches tall. A kitchen could feel like a dangerous battlefield. A human building could become a massive maze. And ordinary household objects could suddenly become vehicles, tools, or weapons. The series mixed detective stories, comedy, action, invention, and adventure, giving every character a different role within the team. And unlike many cartoons where one hero did almost everything, Rescue Rangers depended on teamwork. Chip had the leadership. Dale brought humor and unpredictability. Gadget solved technical problems. Monterey Jack provided strength and experience. And Zipper could get into places the others couldn't. That combination made the team feel like a real group rather than 5 characters simply sharing the same screen. The show also had memorable villains, including Fat Cat, a criminal mastermind who repeatedly found himself on the opposite side of the Rescue Rangers. And because the Rangers were so small, their battles often became much more creative than simple fights. They had to outsmart their enemies. They had to improvise. And sometimes the most ridiculous idea was the one that actually worked. That became part of the charm. Chip and Dale. Rescue Rangers premiered in 1989 and became one of the important shows associated with Disney's late 1980s and early 1990s television animation era. The original series ran for 65 episodes, and its combination of mystery, comedy, adventure, and memorable characters helped it develop a lasting fanbase. But perhaps the most important thing the show did was give Chip and Dale their own identity. They were no longer simply 2 funny chipmunks appearing in someone else's story. They became detectives. They became adventurers. And for an entire generation of viewers, Chip, Dale, Gadget, Monterey Jack, and Zipper became a team they wanted to join on every new mystery. That's what made Rescue Rangers different. It wasn't just about solving mysteries. It was about watching a group of completely different characters come together, use their individual strengths, and somehow turn the smallest clues into the biggest adventures. But our journey was about to leave the world of mysteries and adventures behind, because the next cartoon would take us somewhere much more familiar: school, friendship, imagination, and the complicated process of growing up. 8th Doug. Doug was different from many of the cartoons on television at the time. He didn't have superpowers, magical weapons, or a mission to save the world. He was simply Doug Funny, a regular kid trying to figure out school, friendships, family, and all the confusing little problems that come with growing up. Doug's life revolved around the kinds of situations many kids could understand. School could be stressful, friendships could get complicated, embarrassing moments could feel impossible to forget, and having a crush could make even a normal day feel completely different. But whenever real life became difficult, Doug had something that made his world much more interesting: his imagination. In his mind, ordinary situations could become incredible adventures. His alter ego, Quailman, allowed Doug to imagine himself as the confident hero he sometimes wished he could be. It was funny, but it also revealed something deeper about his character. Doug wasn't always confident in real life, so his imagination gave him a place where he could be brave. His friendships were just as important. Skeeter was his energetic best friend. Patty was the girl Doug admired, and Porkchop was his loyal dog. Together, they made Bluffington feel like a real childhood world filled with familiar faces, everyday adventures, mistakes, jokes, and memories. And that was the real strength of Doug. The show didn't need a giant villain in every episode. Sometimes the biggest problem was a bad day at school, an argument with a friend, an embarrassing mistake, or simply trying to understand how other people saw you. For children watching, those problems weren't small. They were real. That's why so many kids could see themselves in Doug. He wasn't perfect. He got nervous, made mistakes, worried about what people thought of him, and sometimes didn't know what to do next. Doug showed that growing up wasn't about becoming perfect. It was about making mistakes, learning from them, understanding your friends, and slowly discovering who you really were. The original series premiered in 1991 and became one of Nickelodeon's memorable early animated shows before later continuing under Disney. But no matter which version viewers grew up with, the heart of Doug remained the same: a simple story about childhood, friendship, imagination, and growing up. And perhaps that's why Doug is still remembered today. Because he didn't make childhood look perfect. He made it feel real. But if Doug showed us everyday life through the eyes of a child, the next cartoon would take us even deeper into a child's imagination, where babies could turn an ordinary world into an extraordinary adventure. Ninth, Rugrats. What if you could see the world exactly the way a baby sees it? That was the simple but brilliant idea behind Rugrats. Instead of telling stories from the perspective of adults or older children, Rugrats placed its audience inside the world of babies. At the center was Tommy Pickles, a curious and fearless baby who was always ready to explore, even when the adults around him had no idea what was really happening. And Tommy wasn't alone. His best friend Chucky Finster was nervous and cautious, but Tommy's confidence often pushed him into adventures. Then there were twins Phil and Lil, who loved getting into trouble, and Angelica, Tommy's older cousin, who constantly reminded the babies that she was bigger, smarter, and in charge. Together, they created a world where even the most ordinary place could become an enormous adventure. A playroom could become a dangerous jungle. A backyard could feel like an unexplored wilderness. And something as simple as leaving the house could turn into a mission that only the babies understood. But there was something especially clever about the way Rugrats told these stories. The babies saw the world differently from the adults. A simple object could become something completely different in their imagination. Adults might see an ordinary situation, while the babies could turn it into an incredible adventure. And the audience was allowed to experience that world from their point of view. That created one of the show's biggest strengths: the constant contrast between imagination and reality. The babies believed they were facing something huge and dangerous, while the adults often had no idea why they were so excited or frightened. That contrast created the comedy. But underneath the jokes, Rugrats was also about childhood curiosity. Babies don't understand the world the way adults do. They ask questions, misunderstand things, explore everything, and create their own explanations for what they see. Rugrats turned that natural curiosity into stories. The series premiered on Nickelodeon in 1991 and quickly became one of the network's biggest animated successes. Its characters became recognizable far beyond the television screen, appearing in merchandise, video games, movies, and eventually becoming one of the defining franchises of Nickelodeon's history. And the characters themselves became a huge part of the show's identity. Tommy represented courage and curiosity. Chucky represented fear and caution. Phil and Lil brought chaos and humor. And Angelica created another layer of comedy because she was old enough to understand more of the adult world, while still being a child herself. That combination gave Rugrats something many cartoons didn't have. Could be funny for children because of the silly adventures, but adults could also recognize the hidden jokes, misunderstandings, and exaggerated version of everyday family life. And that helped the show grow far beyond a simple children's cartoon. Rugrats became a cultural phenomenon of the 1990s, running for years and building a massive audience. Even after the original series ended, the characters remained recognizable to generations who had grown up watching them. Perhaps that's why Rugrats became so memorable. It didn't just show children a fantasy world. It showed them what their own world might look like from the inside of a child's imagination. A living room could become a battlefield. A family trip could become an epic journey. And the smallest child could suddenly become the hero of the biggest adventure. That was the magic of Rugrats. It made the ordinary feel extraordinary. And our final cartoon on this journey would take that idea of childhood comedy in a completely different direction because its humor wasn't just made for kids. And finally, number 10, Rocko's Modern Life.
Rocko's Modern Life.
By the time the 1990s arrived, cartoons were becoming stranger, louder, and much more willing to experiment. And one show pushed that idea further than most. Rocko's Modern Life. At the center was Rocko, a kind-hearted wallaby who had moved to the strange world of O-Town. But Rocko's new life was anything but normal. Almost everything around him seemed bizarre, unpredictable, and completely out of control. His everyday life was filled with strange jobs, ridiculous situations, unusual neighbors, and problems that could turn into complete chaos within seconds. And Rocko wasn't alone. His best friend Heifer Wolf was loud, carefree, and almost always hungry, while Filbert, the nervous and pessimistic turtle, often brought an entirely different kind of comedy to the group. Together, the three created a strange friendship that became one of the show's most memorable parts. But what really made Rocko's Modern Life different was the way it looked at the modern world. The show took ordinary things: work, shopping, television, neighbors, food, technology, and everyday frustrations, and turned them into bizarre adventures. To a child, these stories could simply look ridiculous and funny. But adults could sometimes see something completely different underneath the jokes. The series was filled with exaggerated situations, strange characters, visual gags, and humor that could work on more than one level. A child could laugh at what was happening on the screen, while an older viewer might notice the satire hidden underneath it. That became one of the show's greatest strengths. Rocko's world was weird, but often, that weirdness was actually a playful exaggeration of real life. The animation itself also helped give the show its unique identity. The characters were expressive, the world was colorful and unpredictable, and the comedy often depended on bizarre visual moments that you simply didn't expect from a children's cartoon. Rocko's Modern Life premiered on Nickelodeon in 1993 and ran for 4 seasons, ending its original television run in 1996. During that time, it developed a dedicated audience and became one of the shows associated with Nickelodeon's memorable 1990s animation era. But its story didn't completely disappear after the original series ended. Years later, the show continued to be remembered by the generation that had grown up watching it, and its unusual style, characters, and humor helped it develop a strong cult following. That's why Rocko is still talked about today. It wasn't just another cartoon where a character went on an adventure every week. It was a strange little world that made fun of modern life while making childhood feel completely unpredictable. Rocko was confused. Heifer was chaotic. Filbert was constantly nervous. And somehow, together, they made the strangest situations feel completely normal. Maybe that's why the show has lasted in people's memories. Because sometimes, the cartoons we remember most aren't the ones that were perfect. They're the ones that were weird enough to be unforgettable. And now, after going back through 10 cartoons that once ruled the screen, there's one question we can't ignore. If these cartoons were once such a huge part of television, then what happened? Why did one after another disappear from the spotlight? What changed? And where did all those cartoons go? Because sometimes, a cartoon doesn't disappear because people stopped loving it. Sometimes the world of television simply moves on. And that's where our story really begins. After going through these 10 cartoons, one thing becomes clear. Each of them gave us something different. Some made us laugh. Some took us on incredible adventures. Some gave us heroes to look up to. And others simply made ordinary childhood moments feel special. But there was one thing they all had in common. At one point, they were everywhere. We knew their characters. We knew their voices. We knew their worlds. And then, slowly, they began disappearing from our screens. New shows arrived. New characters became popular. Television changed, and the way we watched cartoons began to change with it. But that leaves us with one question. If these cartoons were once such a huge part of our childhood, what really happened to them? Did they disappear because people stopped loving them? Or did the world simply move on? To understand that, we have to look beyond the cartoons themselves and look at how television, technology, and an entire generation changed. So let's go back one more time and find out what really happened to the cartoons that once ruled the screen. Maybe these cartoons didn't really disappear. Maybe we simply grew up. Television changed, technology changed, and the way we watched our favorite shows changed too. But the memories they gave us never really disappeared. Heathcliff, Thundarr, Ghostbusters, ThunderCats, Inspector Gadget, DuckTales, Rescue Rangers, Doug, Rugrats, and Rocko's modern life were more than just cartoons. They were part of a generation's childhood. They made us laugh, gave us heroes, took us on adventures, and gave us something to look forward to after school. And even if those old screens are no longer in front of us, somewhere inside us is still that kid who couldn't wait for the next episode to begin. Maybe that's why, after all these years, one familiar character, one old theme song, or one forgotten scene can bring all those memories rushing back. The cartoons changed. We changed. But the childhood they gave us will always be a part of who we are.